The rain had finally stopped, but the air still felt heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. Dr. Henry Armitage adjusted his glasses and stepped out of the SUV, his boots sinking into the mud. Behind him, Dr. Emily Rice and Professor James Morgan followed, their faces tense. The three of them had driven hours to reach Dunwich, a forgotten town tucked deep in the hills of Massachusetts. The kind of place where cell service died and the locals watched you like you didn't belong. And maybe they didn't. The town was off. Even in the daylight, the hills loomed too close, their peaks jagged and unnatural. The valleys between them were dark, even at noon, like the sun couldn't, or wouldn't, reach the bottom. Armitage had read about places like this in old books, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. It felt alive, watching, waiting. The first sign that something was wrong came at Osborne's general store. The moment they walked in, the chatter died. The locals, farmers, mostly, with weathered faces and suspicious eyes, stopped mid-sentence. The cashier, a wiry man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, gave them a once-over and muttered, "You hear about the Fryes?" Armitage exchanged a glance with Rice and Morgan. "What happened to the Fryes?" he asked, though he already had a sinking feeling he knew. The man shook his head. "Ain't my place to say, but if you're looking for answers, start at their place. What's left of it, anyway?" The Frye farm was a nightmare. The house was gone. Not burned, not collapsed, but gone. All that remained was a crater in the ground, the edges charred and sticky with something black and tar-like. The smell hit them first, a nauseating mix of rot and chemicals that made Rice gag. Morgan pulled out his phone and started snapping pictures, but Armitage just stared, his mind racing. The locals had told them bits and pieces. Strange noises in the night, tracks the size of barrels pressed into the mud, cattle torn apart, their bodies twisted in ways that made no sense. And then, 2 nights ago, the Frye family had vanished. No screams, no struggle, just gone. Armitage knelt by the edge of the crater, running his fingers through the sticky residue. It clung to his skin like oil. "This isn't natural," he murmured. "None of this is. You think it's connected to the Whateleys?" Rice asked, her voice low. Armitage didn't answer. He didn't need to. The Whateleys were the reason they were here. A family of recluses who'd lived on Sentinel Hill for generations, practicing God knows what in secret. Wilbur Whateley, the last of the line, had died years ago, but his journals had been a warning. One Armitage had ignored until now. By late afternoon, they pieced together a rough timeline. The Frye family had been the first to go, but they weren't the last. A group of state troopers had come to investigate, but their car was found abandoned near the Frye property. No sign of the officers, just their empty vehicle and a trail of massive footprints leading into the woods. The locals were terrified. Old Sam Hutchins, a grizzled farmer with a face like cracked leather, pointed to a ravine known as Cold Spring Glen. "I told him not to go down there," he said, his voice trembling. "Not with them tracks, not with that smell." But they didn't listen. And now, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. As the sun dipped below the hills, Armitage, Rice, and Morgan prepared for the night. They had no idea what they were up against, but they knew it wasn't human. Rice unpacked a high-powered sprayer filled with a chemical compound she developed, something she hoped would make the invisible visible. Morgan checked his rifle, though Armitage had warned him bullets might not be enough. And Armitage, he clutched a leather-bound notebook filled with incantations and symbols, praying he wouldn't have to use them. The hours dragged by. The woods were eerily silent, save for the occasional cry of a whippoorwill. The three of them sat in the ruins of the Frye property, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made them jump, but nothing came until just before dawn. It started with a low rumble, like thunder but deeper, coming from beneath the ground. Then the smell hit, a wave of rot and decay that made them gag. Rice grabbed her sprayer, her hands shaking as she adjusted the nozzle. Morgan raised his rifle, scanning the trees. And Armitage felt it before he saw it. A pressure in the air, like the world itself was bending. And then, in the distance, the trees began to move. Not from the wind. Something was pushing them aside. Something big. "Get ready," Armitage whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. The trees parted. The ground shook. And then, nothing. The woods fell silent again. The smell faded. The pressure lifted. What the hell was that? Morgan hissed, lowering his rifle. Armitage didn't answer. He was staring at the ground, where a fresh set of tracks had appeared in the mud. Tracks that led straight towards Sentinel Hill. By sunrise, the town was in chaos. A group of farmers had arrived at the Frye property, their faces pale and their voices frantic. They'd seen it, or rather, they'd seen the aftermath. Trees bent and broken, a barn reduced to splinters, and, at the center of it all, a trail of destruction leading toward the hills. "It's coming back," one of the men gasped. "Whatever it is, it's coming back." Armitage felt a chill run down his spine. He'd hoped they'd have more time. But whatever was out there, it wasn't waiting. And it wasn't hiding anymore. "We need to follow it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his gut. "Before it reaches the town." Rice and Morgan nodded, though neither of them looked convinced. The locals hesitated, but in the end, a handful of them agreed to come. They armed themselves with shotguns and axes, their faces grim. Together, they set off towards Sentinel Hill, following the trail of destruction. As they climbed the hill, the air grew colder. The trees thinned out, revealing the summit, a flat, rocky outcrop with a single stone altar at its center. The tracks led straight to it. Armitage felt his stomach drop. He'd read about this place in Wilbur Whately's journals. It was a gateway, a door, and whatever was on the other side, it was trying to get through. "We're too late," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. And then, as if in response, the ground beneath them began to shake. The altar cracked, a deep, jagged line splitting it in two. And from the darkness below, something began to rise.